Hello there. Listen, I know we are on a tight time schedule this morning, so I'm going to do everything I can to be brief. As Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I won't keep you long. But I did think it might be useful for me to start with just a couple of words this morning about the particular perspective I bring, because as John hinted, it is somewhat idiosyncratic. I'm a journalist whose beat is the global Catholic Church, and part of what that means is that I have a special eye on the Vatican, so in a sense, I am what the Italians call a Vaticanista, that is, somebody whose professional expertise is following the vicissitudes of this 108-acre island of ecclesiastical life at the heart of urban Rome that we call the Vatican. Now, that means many things. In part, it means during the roughly one-third of my year that I spend in Rome, I have my sort of finger to the pulse of goings-on in the Holy See, and in practice what that means is that I'm taking a never-ending stream of Vatican officials and visiting bishops and theologians and so forth out to lunch and dinner. Now, listen, it is a real burden of my job that so much of it has to be done over Roman meals, but I want you to know I'm over there carrying the cross for all of you. Okay? It also means that I move when the Pope moves. So during the John Paul years, I went on about 40 trips to about 60 countries with John Paul. I've been on almost all of Benedict XVI's 16 foreign trips. I was just with him in Portugal, and next week I'll be with him in Cyprus. And the story I want to tell you to illustrate my perspective comes out of one of these foreign trips, one of these papal trips. Now, you may know that when the Pope travels, he does so in a sort of weird dual capacity, because the Pope is both a head of state. The Holy See is a sovereign entity under international law. It has diplomatic relations with 179 countries and so on. The Pope also, of course, is a head of the Catholic Church. So when he arrives in a foreign country, he is generally welcomed twice. Once in a very formal diplomatic setting by the president or the prime minister or the king or whoever the head of state is. And then second, usually in a less formal setting by the head of the local Catholic Church, who might be the primate of that country, if this country is one of those that has a traditional primate, might be the president of the Bishops' Conference. But if it's a very small Catholic country that doesn't have its own hierarchy, he is sometimes welcomed by his own nuncio. That's the papal ambassador in that country, who always holds the rank of archbishop. And the story I'm going to tell you comes out of one of these trips to a country that doesn't have any Catholic bishops. This is John Paul's 2002 trip to Azerbaijan. Now, at the time John Paul visited Azerbaijan, there were a grand total of 114 Catholics in the country. I actually did the math. It would have been 4 times less expensive to fly all of them to Rome than to bring the Pope to them. But that, of course, wasn't the point. And so on this day, the welcome for John Paul on behalf of the local Catholics was delivered by the nuncio, who at the time was a very kindly, elderly Italian Monsignore, salt of the earth guy. He's since gone on to his reward. As I say, a wonderful man, but he had a reputation, and I am here to tell you it was a well-deserved reputation as a bit of a windbag. I mean, he had this remarkable Italian oratorical capacity just to go on and on and on. And the miracle of it is, without ever saying anything, you know, you'd be listening to him in Italian, and you would keep asking yourself, where the hell are the verbs? Because nothing ever appeared to happen in any of these sentences. This particular day, our Monsignore friend was in rare form. I actually clocked the welcome, ladies and gentlemen, at 40 minutes. And bear in mind, this was a 24-hour trip. We thought John Paul would be back in Rome before this guy was done welcoming him to Baku. Now, for this welcome, I happened to be in the press pool, which means that I was at the end of one row of seats, and immediately across the aisle, it was a very narrow aisle, was the Vatican seguito. What is that? Entourage. That is the cardinals and other senior officials who travel with the Holy Father. Which meant that I was seated more or less immediately next to a guy I've known for many years, a very senior Vatican cardinal. And I could tell, as this oration was winding on, our cardinal friend was becoming increasingly frustrated. You can tell these things, right? Because his breathing was becoming more labored, and, you know, veins were throbbing on his forehead and so on. And I actually thought the guy was going to burst. So at one stage, I leaned across the aisle, and I whispered to the cardinal, "Cardinal, what do you think?" Well, there was this nanosecond of hesitation. You could tell he was thinking, should I say this, should I not say it? But it was obvious he needed to get this off his chest. So the cardinal leans into me, and looking up at this Italian Monsignore going on and on and on and saying nothing. In this kind of sotto voce fashion, the cardinal whispered, "You realize that some Italian village is missing its idiot." True story. Now, in addition to being a once-in-a-career punchline, I think this story makes a valuable point, which is that only seen from afar could the Vatican, or for that matter, the global Catholic Church, look like a kind of Stepford Wives environment in which everyone dresses alike and thinks alike and talks alike and acts alike. I mean, the truth is, when you know any institution on an up-close and personal basis, what reveals itself to you is its complexity. And it's some of that appreciation for complexity that I hope I can bring to you here today in the guise of my attempt to sort of capture some of the most important trends shaping the Catholic future. This is the project I've been working on. Can we have the presentation? There we go. This is the project I've been working on, as John said, in some ways for the last 15 years, although the actual writing is more like the last couple of years, and which forms the basis of my book, The Future Church. This is the full list of 10 trends that I have identified as sort of key forces shaping the Catholic future. Now, in the interest of time today, we're only going to be able to get to 3 or 4. The obvious corollary to that is that if you want the skinny on the rest of them, you really only have one choice, which is, of course, buy the book. And ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you, graduation season is right around the corner, and then we're going to have ordinations and anniversaries and birthdays, and the holidays will be on us before you know it. Believe me, this is the perfect stocking stuffer for that special Catholic in your life. Okay? But this is my attempt to sort of capture the sort of primal forces that are, I think, pregnant with consequence in terms of carrying the church into the 21st century. One other caveat that I need to give you before we get into the meat of it is that today we are operating at the descriptive rather than the prescriptive level. That is, we're living in the world of is rather than ought. Okay? This is not my private vision of the 10 forces that ought to be shaping the Catholic future. That would be a very interesting conversation to have, and I'm sure we'd all have our personal favorites. But instead, this is a descriptive attempt to lay before you certain forces that, on the basis of my own experience as a reporter and consulting better minds than mine around the world, to lay out forces that really are shaping the Catholic future, regardless of what you or I might privately think about them. All right? With that, let's get into the meat of it. The first trend is what I call the emergence of a world church. World church. The picture on the slide was taken during Benedict XVI's recent trip to Africa last March. Benedict visited Cameroon and Angola. This was at the very end of the stop in Cameroon. I was about 50 feet away or so when this picture was taken. At the end of this trip, Benedict was greeted by a delegation of local indigenous persons, popularly known as pygmies, and they performed a dance for the Holy Father, as you can see, and then they presented him with a memento of his visit, which was a giant sea turtle. Now, being the enterprising Vaticanista that I am, I immediately scuttled off to the Vatican spokesperson to ask what was going to become of this giant sea turtle. I was told it was being airlifted to Rome. However, he refused to comment on whether it was being airlifted as a pet or an ingredient in a stew, so we still don't know. But in any event, I think this picture does capture some of the broad transitions underway in global Catholicism. The famous Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner once said that in the long run of history, the significance of the Second Vatican Council in the mid-1960s is that it marked the emergence of Catholicism really for the first time as a self-consciously global community of faith. And what I want to argue today is that Catholic demographics in the 20th century lend empirical confirmation to Rahner's theological argument. What this slide shows you is what happened to the global Catholic population in the 20th century. As you can see, in 1900, at the dawn of the 20th century, scarcely more than 100 years ago, there were 266 million Catholics in the world, of whom 200 million, that's the orange bar, lived in Europe and North America, and just 66 million in the rest of the world, principally in Latin America. This, of course, was before the population explosion of the 20th century. 100 years later, in the year 2000, you can see what happened. Within that 100-year arc of time, the population in the global south exploded to 720 million, that's the green bar, while the Catholic population in the global north, Europe and North America, became 380 million. Another way of putting that point is that at the dawn of the 20th century, just 25% of the global Catholic population lived in the southern hemisphere. By 2000, that figure was 65.5%, in other words, 2/3. And if you roll the clock forward to mid-century, that is by 2050, the projection is it will be 3/4. That is, within about 40 years, 3 out of every 4 Catholic men, women, and children alive will live in the global south. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the most rapid, most sweeping, most profound transformation of Catholic demography in more than 2,000 years of church history. And it is, I would suggest to you, a classic example of what the social critic Neil Postman talked about as organic rather than additive change. You know, additive change adds something to a pre-existing structure. Organic change changes everything at once. And that is precisely what we are living through today. I would submit to you that the demographic transformation we are experiencing today is tantamount to that moment in the first century when St. Paul left Palestine and Syria on his way to Greece and ultimately to Rome, thereby transforming Christianity from a sect within Palestinian Judaism to a new religious movement in the ancient Hellenistic world. I mean, that is the order of magnitude we are talking about in terms of the implications of this transformation. Now, obviously, the $64,000 question is, what is all of this going to mean, right? In other words, what is this transition from north to south in terms of the Catholic center of gravity going to mean in the 21st century? Now, I'm going to answer that question, or I'm at least going to try, but before I do that, let me give you an industrial-sized grain of salt, which is that anytime someone stands before you peddling generalizations about 720 million people, you need to be cautious, huh? Because for any generalized statement I could make about Catholicism in the global south, there are literally millions, if not tens of millions, of exceptions. That said, I think these 4 generalizations do hold up in terms of the kinds of things that we are going to be seeing and hearing and tasting and smelling in the 21st century from our brothers and sisters in the global south. First, you will find that there is a mainstream meat and potatoes consensus in Christianity and in Catholicism in the global south that by our standards is going to come off as fairly conservative or fairly traditional on matters of sexual morality, fairly progressive or fairly liberal on virtually everything else. Now, I'll unpack that, but first let me say this business of dividing humanity up into left and right, into liberals and conservatives, this is our taxonomy, huh? It's not theirs. I mean, this is a kind of mental framework that doesn't occur naturally to people in other parts of the world. I was in Uganda a few months ago meeting with some political science majors at Xavier University in Kampala. And these are, again, poli-sci majors, 20-somethings. And I asked them if they were liberals or conservatives. And they had this sort of deer-caught-in-the-headlights look and asked me what I meant by that. And so I tried to get into this in a way that I thought would be approachable. I said, well, you know, are you in favor of big government or limited government? I said, well, we can see the argument for each. I said, okay, let's try something easier. Do you like George Bush or not? Okay. And again, well, we can see some positive, you know. Anyway, at the end of it, this sort of 20-minute, you know, excursus on what it means by American standards to be liberal or conservative, their heartfelt answer was, I guess we're both. And they meant it. They meant it. Okay? So my point is, I am here imposing a taxonomy that doesn't arise naturally from the part of the world I'm trying to describe. Having said that, I think these categories mean something to us, and therefore at a rough and ready level, they're useful. So on the hot-button issues of the cultural wars, things like abortion, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, gender roles, the traditional family, there you will find a strong, I would say almost overwhelming consensus in most parts of the global south that by our standards is going to seem quite traditional or quite conservative. Yet when you switch the subject to other issues, things like war and peace, foreign relations, race relations, the environment, the ethics of free market global capitalism, that whole cluster of what we would think about as social justice issues, once again, you will find an overwhelming meat and potatoes consensus at the top and the bottom in Southern Catholicism that by our standards will seem remarkably liberal, remarkably progressive. Usually the soundbite way I try to capture that is this, that since April 2003, I have probably interviewed 300 Catholic bishops from various parts of the global south. I have never found one, not one, who wouldn't say that the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in April 2003 failed the Catholic Church's tests for a just war. Now, I know that's a controversial point. We could have a healthy debate about it, but I'm just trying to describe a climate of opinion. Okay? So what you will get is this intriguing mix of positions on some issues by our ideological standards are going to seem quite conservative, and on other issues by our ideological standards are going to seem very liberal. In other words, for every constituency in the Catholic Church in the United States, there will be something to cheer about the rise of the Global South and something to complain about. Okay? Second, the thought world of global Catholicism is very much rooted in the thought world of the Bible as opposed to speculative academic theology. And in part what that means is that things like miracles and wonders, healings and revelations, demonic combat and exorcism, all of that stuff that to us can sometimes seem a bit archaic or arcane is very much part of the meat and potatoes daily spiritual experience of believers in the South. The supernatural is close. It is palpable. You can almost reach out and touch it. This has very practical consequences, among other things, for the ministry of healthcare, because people in the Global South do not interpret disease in exclusively physical cause and effect terms. They also interpret it in terms of the interaction of spiritual forces. And if you don't understand that, you're not treating the whole person. Okay, third, the primary grassroots challenge to the faith in the Global South isn't secularism. Okay? In fact, to be honest with you, in places like Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, you have to look pretty long and hard to find an actual secularist. Okay, really, Europe and certain pockets of the United States are about the only place that sociologically speaking, secularism has a strong grassroots footprint. In most of the world, the primary challenge facing the church is instead the competitive dynamics of a flourishing religious marketplace. So in most of the Global South, people are not choosing between Christianity and secularism. They're choosing which brand of religious faith and practice most appeals to them. The primary, therefore, the primary competitor, so to speak, for the Catholic Church isn't secularism. It tends to be on the one side Christian Pentecostalism, and on the other side, depending on what part of the world you're in, perhaps Islam, perhaps nationalist Hinduism, but in any event, it's a much different landscape. And in part, that means the church in the Global South is less inclined to fight ideological battles against secularism, much more likely to position itself as the moderate and modern alternative between these other religious options. Fourth and finally, if you want a defining characteristic of Catholicism in the Global South, it is youth and optimism. Here is a factoid to put in your pipe and smoke. According to the United Nations Population Division, 90% of the human beings on the planet today who are under 14 years of age are in the Global South. 90%. And the Catholic Church in the South reflects those demographics. I mean, I will tell you that when you go to the typical Catholic parish in sub-Saharan Africa for a Sunday liturgy, quite often you don't know if you're in a church or a daycare center because kids are literally hanging from the rafters. Okay? And psychologically, that sort of imposes a widely held sense among the leadership ranks of the church in the South that historically speaking, their moment has come. And you can clearly see this if you can contrast the first African Synod, that is the gathering of bishops from Africa in Rome in 1994 versus the one that took place last year. In 94, the Africans came to Rome very much with a sense of being junior partners in a multinational enterprise. Last year, they came to Rome very much with the sense of being leaders of the part of the world where the church was the healthiest and most likely to lead in the 21st century. Okay? So there is a kind of psychology and a kind of cultural shift there in which leaders of the church in the Global South are very much aware that their moment historically is dawning. All right. And one footnote to that, which is that this increasingly multicultural, multi-chrome, sort of brave new world I'm describing in the church is not something you have to go to the four corners of the earth to find, ladies and gentlemen. It's outside the door of this building. Because increasingly, the demographics of American Catholicism are, in microcosm, a reflection of the broader Catholic story. This slide shows you the Pew Forum's estimate of what Catholic demographics in America will be by 2030. The bottom line is this, that for the first time, white Catholics will no longer be a statistical majority of the American Catholic community. Whites will still be a plurality at 48%, but Hispanics will be 41%, Asian American Catholics 7.5%, Africans and African Americans at 3%, and that's an important point because in addition to traditional African American Catholic populations, there's also a rapidly swelling African diaspora in America, which is disproportionately Catholic. Everybody else at 0.5. The point is that getting our minds around the implications of of Catholic demographics isn't simply an exercise in global solidarity. It's also a very practical way to get ready for the American Catholic experience that is being born even as we speak. All right, if our first trend concentrates largely on the global south, our second trend is more focused on the global north. And it's what I call the rise of evangelical Catholicism. Now here I am obviously taking a word from our Protestant brothers and sisters and I'm translating it back into a Catholic context. I would define evangelical Catholicism this way. First, a revival of traditional Catholic identity. That is, those markers of Catholic thought, Catholic speech, and Catholic practice that over the centuries have set us apart from the rest of the world and told us who we are. Things like Mass in Latin, or at least in English closer to the Latin. Priests wearing Roman collars, religious wearing habits, Eucharistic adoration, Marian devotion. All of those things that in the years immediately after the Second Vatican Council sometimes seem passé, but obviously are in some ways staging a comeback these days. Second, the public proclamation of that identity, that is the idea of evangelizing culture, because this is the essence of being evangelical, isn't it? You don't hide your faith under a bushel basket, you shout it from the rooftops. And then third, faith understood as a matter of personal choice. In this sense, evangelical Catholicism is a natural byproduct of secularism in the North. Because this is precisely what secularism does, isn't it? It erodes those traditionally homogeneous Catholic neighborhoods and schools and families and so forth. I mean, some of you in this room may be old enough to remember what it was like to grow up in a ghetto church in the United States, You remember what that felt like, what it smelled like, what it tasted like, and you know that is no longer the world in which we live. If you want to be a practicing, believing Roman Catholic in this culture, you can't rely on simple cultural momentum to propel you in that direction. It has to be a personal choice. It has to be intentional. Now, as I say, in that sense, evangelical Catholicism is a byproduct of secularism. But you also have to understand that it is a carefully and consciously crafted strategy as an antidote to secularism. That is, to help ensure that the church is not seduced by and assimilated to a kind of hyper-secularist milieu. And to understand why that is the preoccupation, bar none, of the church's leadership class today, I think we have to understand something about the sociology of contemporary Europe. Because bear in mind, despite everything I said about the increasing globality of the Catholic Church, I mean, let's remember that the leadership structure of the Catholic Church is still concentrated in Europe. I mean, we don't call it the Roman Catholic Church for nothing, and therefore, European realities tend to have a disproportionate effect in shaping the imaginations of the Church's leadership class. And this slide intends, what it does is present some of those European realities. It's data from the most recent Pew Global Values Project. What the Pew people do is every few years they go around to 16 countries in various parts of the world, and they ask people, how important is religion to you? And you can say very important, somewhat important, and so on. These are the percentages in various countries of people who said that religion is very important. Okay? So we begin with Indonesia, the largest Muslim country on earth, a population of about 300 million that is about 97% Muslim. And by the way, we're not going to talk about Islam today, but just as a footnote, this is an important thing to understand about global Islam. We tend to see Islam through the prism of Arab Islam, but bear in mind, only about a quarter of Muslims in the world are actually Arabs. 3/4 are not. So in Indonesia, 95% of the population said, yes, religion is very important. In Nigeria, which is the world's largest mixed Muslim-Christian nation, a population of about 200 million that is roughly evenly divided between Muslims in the north and Christians in the south, 92% of the population said religion is very important. Guatemala, which is still an overwhelmingly Christian, though no longer overwhelmingly Catholic society, about a generation ago, that is 25 years ago, Guatemala was about 98% Catholic. Officially today, it is about 48% Catholic. Some sociologists think the number is actually lower. And almost all of that attrition has been in favor of Christian Pentecostalism, Pentecostalism being by far the most rapidly growing religious movement on the global scene today. In Guatemala, 80% of the population said religion is very important. The United States clocks in at a still respectable 59%, which makes an important point, ladies and gentlemen, which is that we have pockets of aggressive secularism in the United States, but at the grassroots, we are still a profoundly religious society. The Austrian sociologist Peter Berger, who taught for many years at Boston University, is now an emeritus professor there. Peter has a soundbite for all of this. He says that from the point of view of religious sociology, America is a nation of Indians, by which he means Asian Indians, a profoundly religious people. We're a nation of Indians governed by Swedes, the most thoroughly secularized culture on earth. And there's a lot to be said for that. But look what happens when we get into Europe, okay? Poland, ladies and gentlemen, 36%. Italy, the headquarters of Roman Catholicism Incorporated, 27%. Germany, the birthplace of the Protestant Reformation, 21%. Russia, the cradle of Russian Orthodoxy, 14%. France, the eldest daughter of the Church, 11%. And the Czech Republic, the home of the Bohemian Reformation, 11%. The point is that contemporary Europe is pretty much on the opposite end of the spectrum from the rest of the world in terms of the vitality of religious faith and practice. And I think if that helps explain why this effort to protect and foster a strong sense of Catholic identity is job number one for the leadership class of the church these days. Because if these are the realities that you're tripping across on the way to work in the morning, if this is the social milieu in which you think the church lives and moves and has its being, then certainly the effort to inoculate the church against this kind of runaway secularization makes sense. And well, just to make the point that this is not my private journalistic hypothesis, this is a quotation from the Vatican Secretary of State, Italian Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, in effect the number 2 person in the power structure after the Holy Father himself. 3 years ago, Cardinal Bertone was speaking to a group in Milan, and he was asked, what is the main objective of the pontificate of Benedict XVI? And he said, to recover authentic Christian identity in the context of widespread secularism. So in other words, I'm not making this up. This is more or less the stated policy of the papacy of Benedict XVI. And therefore, I would say that this trend, evangelical Catholicism, is the most important trend to get your mind around if you want to understand the way the policy-making apparatus of the church is operating these days. That is, why decisions are being made the way they are in the Vatican or in the U.S. Bishops' Conference or at the level of individual dioceses. Okay. But I would also submit that you're going to get this wrong if you see it exclusively as a top-down trend, because it is also very definitely a bottom-up force in the church these days. Many different ways I could make that point, but this slide gives you the key findings from a recent study conducted by the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown on behalf of the National Religious Vocations Conference. About new entrants into religious life these days, that is, new members of men's and women's religious communities in the United States. Essentially, what the study found is a sharp contrast between millennials, that is, those born after 1982, and what they call the Vatican II generation, that is, older members of religious orders. In brief, they found that millennials are more likely to emphasize fidelity to the church and to say they chose the community they joined because of its reputation for fidelity. They're more likely to wear habits, to stress traditional devotions. They have a more positive attitude towards authority. And if you want the clearest possible bit of data from this study in terms of which way the winds are blowing, in terms of where practicing young Catholics are at these days, consider this. What the study found is that in terms of women's communities in the United States, those communities that have 10 or more new members in the initial stages of formation, they found that members of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, that is the main umbrella group for women religious, which has a profile as being a bit more liberal, only 1% of those communities have 10 or more members in initial stages of formation. Whereas for the Conference of Major Superiors, that actually should be a W there at the end, sorry, Conference of Major Superiors of Women, that's a group that has a profile for being a bit more traditional or conservative. Those communities, 28% of them, have at least 10 or more members in the initial stages of formation. Now, bear in mind, we're talking about data here that is not applicable to the broad mass of 20 and 30-something young Catholics out there, but we're talking about those that are most actively committed to the church and the faith. There is a clear evangelical ethos. And those folks, of course, are going to be our future leaders. They will be our future priests and sisters. They will be our future bishops. They will lead us in terms of our departments of theology. They will be our future lay activists, and so on. So in other words, evangelical Catholicism is both top-down and it's bottom-up. And the result, therefore, is that there isn't an area of Catholic life these days that is immune to pressures over identity. One place you see it very clearly is in the liturgy. This is why the Holy Father authorized in 2007 wider celebration of the so-called Tridentine Rite, that is the Old Latin Mass, because it's a classic carrier of Catholic identity. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why in your local parish on a Sunday in the not-too-distant future, when you show up for the Sunday liturgy and the celebrant says to you, "The Lord be with you," your answer will no longer be, "and also with you." It will be, say it with me, "and with your spirit." Because this is a more faithful translation of the Latin original, "et cum spiritu tuo." My point is that if you try to see that in isolation, you're going to get it wrong. You have to see it as a small piece of a much bigger picture, and the bigger picture is this effort to foster a robust sense of Catholic identity vis-a-vis the secular world. We also see this in debates over doctrine. I'm not going to get bogged down in the details. Even Catholic charities these days are not immune to identity pressures. And obviously, I'm carrying coals to Newcastle here because I suspect there is not a single person involved in the enterprise of Jesuit higher education who, in the course of the last 10 or 15 years, has not been involved in multiple conversations about the Catholic identity of our universities. How do we know that what we're doing is Catholic? How do we express that Catholicity to the rest of the world? How do we defend it against threats to assimilate to secularism and so on? It is very much the order of the day. My concluding thought, therefore, on this trend is that with respect to evangelical Catholicism, I think the uber challenge of the 21st century is steering a middle course between two extremes. On the one end of the spectrum, we have what my friend and colleague George Weigel, correctly I think, describes as Catholicism light. That is a kind of supine assimilation to the values and the worldview of secular modernity. So what Jacques Maritain, in his famous novel, The Peasant of the Garonne, his last book in 1965 at the end of the council, Maritain described as kneeling before the world. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, if we take a clear-eyed look around at the church, we can all find examples of this. In other words, it is a real and present danger. It's not merely hypothetical. Now, at the other end of the spectrum is what I have, admittedly, somewhat tongue-in-cheek and somewhat provocatively, characterized as Taliban Catholicism. And by that I mean a kind of distorted and angry form of the faith that really knows only how to excoriate and condemn and sort of, run around smashing the metaphorical TV sets of the modern world. And again, I think if we are honest with ourselves, if we take a clear-eyed look around, we can also find examples of this instinct on the contemporary Catholic landscape. And therefore, it seems to me that the central challenge we will face in terms of making sure this impulse in the church, which, make no mistake, is not going away, to make sure this impulse in the church is healthy rather than counterproductive, we're going to have to fall back on an ancient piece of Aristotelian wisdom, which was codified as a principle of Catholic thought by Thomas Aquinas, which is in medio stat virtus. Virtue stands in the middle, okay, steering a middle course between these two potential extremes. All right. The next trend I want to talk about is expanding lay roles, which is, without any doubt, one of the signs of the times of the church in the early 21st century. By the way, I originally had thought of titling this trend Expanding Roles for Laity and Women, but then a canon lawyer pointed out to me that that is one of the great redundancies in canon law, because, of course, canonically, you're either fish or fowl. You're either ordained or you're not. And therefore, just understand that expanding roles for women is definitely understood as part of this trend. Signs of expanding lay roles are all around us. We have the new movements, groups like Focolari and Comunioni in Liberazione and Sant'Egidio and on and on. We have the phenomenon of lay missionaries and post-college volunteerism, and certainly Jesuit universities have been one of the real pioneers there. we have a category that I like to describe as guerrilla evangelists. That is, people who are not part of any formal movement or association, but who have simply planted the flag for the faith in some sphere of life kind of under their own steam. Favorite example is a guy by the name of Peter Dobbins in New York. Peter is a very thoughtful, intelligent lay Catholic in his late 30s who is part of the theater scene, the Broadway scene in New York. And a few years ago, he decided that somebody needed to evangelize the Great White Way. And so he launched something called the Storm Theater. The title is from a line in Titus Andronicus. Now is a time to storm, why art thou still? Okay? And the Storm Theater puts on, some of their plays have explicit religious themes. A lot of them are just sort of generic humanitarian themes. A couple of years ago, the Storm Theater put on a festival with all the theatrical works of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, who, as you know, was a playwright before he became Pope, to phenomenally positive reviews in all the secular theater publications, sold-out audiences, people who had no idea, really, that John Paul was ever a playwright, no particular interest in the Catholic Church, but were nevertheless drawn by the quality of the drama. Now, the great sort of comedy of all this is that when Peter started the Storm Theater, he certainly didn't ask permission from the Archdiocese of New York to do so, and in fact, you know, they refused repeated requests for him for financial assistance and for publicity and for support. Once the John Paul II Festival was a smash success, of course, they wrapped him in a warm, loving embrace, and now he's listed in the official directories and all of that stuff. But the point is, he's an example of a broader phenomenon, which is lay people who are not waiting for anyone to give them permission, who are simply seeing an apostolic need and responding to it. Then, of course, we have the growth of lay ecclesial ministry. This is a new occupational category of people who are liturgical ministers and youth ministers and RCIA people and so forth, who are either part or full-time paid employees of the Catholic Church, not just in the United States, although we're the ones who have invented this vocabulary, who are increasingly carrying the ministerial load that was once carried by priests and women religious. And then finally, we have the emergence of financial and pastoral councils and review boards. All of these are post-Vatican II instruments to involve laity in the governance of the Church. Now, I know that they've got a kind of mixed track record, and frankly, I would never sit on one. I mean, these kind of pastoral councils remind me of what Oscar Wilde once said about socialism. He said the problem with socialism is that it takes up too many evenings. And, you know, I'm not one to sit on committees and have conversations, but in any event, they are a kind of new attempt to structuralize a role for the laity in the governance apparatus of the Church. And all of this, the point is, all of this is new to the 20th century. Okay? Now, one way to see which way the winds are blowing is to compare the number of priests in the United States and the number of lay ecclesial ministers. As you can see, as of 2005, there were 43,000 Catholic priests in America and about 31,000 lay ecclesial ministers. At that time, there were 5,500 seminarians in the pipeline and 18,000 people, lay people, preparing for work as lay ecclesial ministers, which means that at some point in the very near future, these two lines are going to cross. We will have more lay ecclesial ministers in the United States than we do priests, and throughout the 21st century, they will continue to diverge. Okay? Very clear sign of which way the broader winds are blowing. What are the forces driving this expansion? Well, you know, I think often we want to attribute this all either to Vatican II's theology of the laity or to priest shortages. We frankly think it's a mix of all of that and other factors as well. But one point to bear in mind is the very practical reality of priest shortages around the world, and I think it's helpful for American audiences to understand that however bad we may think the priest shortage is here, it is infinitely worse in other parts of the world. That's what this slide is intended to communicate. In the United States and in Europe, we have a ratio of about 1 priest to every 1,300 baptized Catholics. But look what it is in Africa. It's 1 to 5,000. Look what it is in Latin America. It's 1 to 7,000. In Southeast Asia, it's 1 to 5,000. In other words, in any foreseeable future that we can anticipate, the frontline, day-to-day ministerial and apostolic work of the Catholic Church is either going to be done by energized laity or it's not going to happen. Okay? It's a practical reality. Finally, last trend I want to talk about is multipolarism. That is, the emergence of a world that is not dominated by 2 superpowers as it was during the Cold War, not dominated by a single superpower as it was for that brief interlude immediately after the Cold War, when we were the world's lone superpower, but a world increasingly in which there are multiple points of reference. Now, I should say, this is not the preferred term for American diplomats in describing new global realities. Secretary of State Clinton likes to talk about multi-partnerism instead of multipolarism. She says that's because it's a more friendly term, although frankly I think it's because multipolarism was coined by the French and therefore it carries a whiff of anti-Americanism. But in any event, whatever label you want to put on it, increasingly it's a sign of the times. The two most obvious candidates to be the new poles of this multipolar system are India and China. Already have 1/3 of the world's combined population. And by mid-century, their combined GDP is going to be greater than the combined GDP of the United States and Europe. But they're hardly the only candidates. We also have the petropowers. That is, those countries whose massive oil and gas resources are inevitably going to make them major players on the global stage. And of the top 5 oil-producing nations in the world, 4 of them, with the possible exception of Norway, clearly do have aspirations to be players on the global stage. That bar chart at the bottom is intended to make the point that no matter what we in the United States or Europe do in terms of reducing our own oil consumption, the voracious appetite of China for petroleum throughout the first half of the 21st century is going to mean that these countries will remain awash in cash. And therefore, they will have the potential to exercise influence on the global stage. And then finally, there's the Shia arc, that is, that band of countries from Lebanon on the Mediterranean coast all the way through the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, where Shiites are either a majority or a significant minority that are increasingly thinking themselves as a bloc, with Iran playing a critical leadership role. In the long run, probably the most significant consequence of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 will be that for the first time, you now have a majority Arab state that is being governed by Shiites, and that has unleashed an enormous wave of energy and self-confidence in the Shia world, and increasingly they will be acting as an important regional force. What's the payoff of all this for the Catholic Church? It is this. Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time, the Catholic Church is going to be living in a mental world in which Christian powers are not the only game in town. Now, obviously, the Catholic Church has known non-Christian powers throughout the centuries, from the ancient Persians to the Sassanids to the Mongols to the Ottomans and so forth and so on. But those powers were largely external to the mental world in which the Catholic Church lived, which was largely focused on Europe and later North America. There was always, in that part of the world, in that mental world, the leadership forces, the forces that set the tone, spoke the language of the Christian tradition. In the world in which we're going to be living in the 21st century, that will increasingly not be the case. And therefore, there will be 2 primary challenges. One, we have to revive the capacity to speak in terms of natural law rather than a specifically Christian argot. And 2, we're going to be emphasizing interreligious relations. And by the way, let me give you a prediction. My prediction is that by mid-century, we are going to be thinking of the effort to engage Hindu radicalism with the same urgency and the same emphasis with which we regard the effort to engage Muslim radicalism today. There is an enormously important and growing and very wealthy Indian diaspora around the world that is aggressively seeking to export nationalist and radicalist Hinduism to various corners of the world. This will be a project of incredible urgency. And so, let me try to put a bow on this and draw to a close. It seems to me that from the 4 trends we have analyzed, there are 4 obvious challenges for the enterprise of Jesuit education in the 21st century. One, trying to foster a global perspective. And these are all things you were already doing. I would simply encourage you to augment those efforts. Trying to educate your students to think of themselves not merely as citizens of the United States or as members of the Catholic Church in the United States, but as citizens of the planet and members of a global family of faith. One more factoid for you. As of today, there are 1.2 billion Roman Catholics in the world, and there are 67 million Catholics in the United States, which means that we Catholics in America are exactly 6% of the global Catholic population, 6%, which means that 94% of the Catholics in the world, in important respects, are not necessarily like us. And by the way, if you ever want to know why the Pope does not get out of bed in the morning thinking American thoughts, this might have something to do with it. It's a much bigger and more complex global church out there. You have the opportunity, and I would say the challenge, of educating your students in what that means. Second, fostering a spirituality of communion. I'll come back to that in a moment. Third, acting as a support system for this burgeoning lay activism. and not just in formal associations and movements or in formal modes of ecclesial lay ministry, as important as all that is, but also identifying, studying, supporting all those grassroots, sort of amorphous forms of guerrilla evangelism that increasingly are essential to the Catholic future. And then finally, a laboratory for interreligious and intercultural dialogue. As you know, Pope Benedict XVI, when he met with Jesuits after the most recent election of the Superior General and General Congress, he reiterated the traditional charge for the Jesuit order of being the pioneers that stand at the frontiers of culture. That has never been more critical than in this increasingly multipolar world in which people, global powers not formed by the Christian tradition, are increasingly going to be our dialogue partners. All right. Final thought is this. On this subject of fostering communion, it seems to me that before we can get to the business of addressing these specific challenges, there is a more basic root challenge we have to face. Okay? Because each of these forces I've outlined, and all the other 6 that we didn't talk about, in my view, these are all rich with the potential for unleashing creative new energies in the Catholic Church. But they are also fraught with the potential for new division and new internal paralysis. Because let's face it, these are complicated matters. And there is more than one opinion in the Church about how we ought to respond. And therefore, if we cannot foster a kind of spirituality and an internal climate in the Church in which we emphasize those things that unite us rather than those things that divide us, in which we emphasize listening to the best of what the various Catholic tribes have to offer, rather than forever beginning with what we don't like about what other Catholics think or say or do, then these trends are going to be a prescription for self-destruction. And if you'll permit me, I'm going to tell one last story to try to drive that point home, and then I'll be done. Story is this. Some of you may know that I grew up in rural western Kansas. Now, I don't know if any of you here have ever been to rural western Kansas, and to be honest with you, I can think of no reason on God's earth why you should have been. But if you ever have been, you will know it is not exactly a thriving crossroads of the tourist industry. In fact, the only time we get significant numbers of out-of-town visitors is in the fall, because that's pheasant hunting season. And there's a certain kind of guy that finds the idea of putting on combat fatigues and blasting shotguns in the sky over the course of a weekend to be a real hoot. Now, usually this is done while consuming massive amounts of beer, so they're a far greater threat to one another than they are to the pheasants. But nevertheless, they come. My 96-year-old grandma, God bless her, lives in a small western Kansas hamlet called Hill City. It is my candidate for the least accurate place name in America, because there is no hill and there sure as hell is no city. Okay, we're talking about 500 people on a good day. Okay? Now, ladies and gentlemen, you know, as I told you at the outset, I have traveled the 4 corners of the world. I have stayed in some pretty funky lodgings hither and yon. But I'm here to tell you, the one motel in Hill City, it's called the Western Hills Motel, 11 rooms. It is the only place on God's earth I have ever been where there is a laminated sign in the bathroom that reads, "Please do not gut your birds in the sink." Okay? I kid you not. The first time I took my wife there, she asked, "Is this some kind of weird sexual double entendre?" And I had to explain, "No, honey, they're serious." Okay? Just to give you a sense of the culture milieu I'm talking about. All right. Now, this anecdote is set on one weekend during pheasant hunting season. We've got an out-of-town guy, let's call him a lawyer from New York, who has come out to Graham County, America, to try to bag himself a bird. And he's spent a long and frustrating weekend without success. And finally, it's time to go home. He decides he's going to take one last shot. So he shoulders his weapon. He sees a pheasant moving across the skyline. He fires, and miracle of miracles, he brings down the bird. And so now, flushed with triumph, he sets across the field to pick up his trophy. But just as he gets to the spot where the pheasant has fallen, he comes across a barbed wire fence that is clearly labeled "Private Property, Keep Out." But he has invested too much blood, toil, tears, and sweat at this stage, so he starts to climb over the fence. And just as he does so, the western Kansas farmer pulls up in his tractor and says, "Hey, buddy, what are you doing?" And the lawyer says, "Well, it's my pheasant. I'm going to pick it up." And the farmer says, "Oh, no, you're not. That pheasant fell on my property. It belongs to me." Now, the lawyer, of course, is hot. He's tired. He's in a hurry. He just erupts. He says, "Look, you don't understand. I am a senior partner in a top 10 law firm in New York, and if you don't let me have that bird, I am going to sue you back to the Stone Age." not understanding this is pretty much where the farmer already is, right? I grew up there, so I'm licensed to say this stuff. So the farmer looks at him and smiles and says, well, that may be how you do things where you come from, but around here we have a little something called the 3-kick rule. The 3-kick rule, what's that about? Farmer says, it's very simple. I kick you 3 times, you kick me 3 times, we keep going. Whoever eventually gives up loses the bird. Okay? And the lawyer thinks, well, it's probably less expensive than a lawsuit. Plus, this guy looks like he's 197 years old. I can probably take him. It's all right, let's do it. So they line up against one another. Farmer looks at him and says, are you ready? Lawyer says, yes, I am. Now, the farmer, you understand, is wearing these heavy, mud-clad Western Kansas work boots, right? So he gives him 1 shot in the shins. The guy howls in pain. Okay? Gives him another shot in the solar plexus. This time, his cries of agony can be heard to the Nebraska border. And I can tell there's one person in this room that knows their Western Kansas geography, because this is a fair stretch from where I'm talking about, huh? So he gives him 1 last shot under the chin. This time, the lawyer is, seeing stars. He's barely conscious. But finally, with his last best ounce of effort, he draws himself to his feet. He dusts himself off. He puts this look of grim determination on his face, stares the farmer dead in the eye and says, all right, you old coot, now it's my turn. And the farmer looks at him and smiles and says, that's all right, I give up. You can have the bird. Ladies and gentlemen, I would submit to you that too often our internal conversation in the Catholic Church reduces to a kind of ecclesiastical version of the 3-kick rule. That is, too often we are not really interested in a patient search for understanding with Catholics who may think differently than we do, who may worship differently than we do, who may vote differently than we do. Too often what we're really interested in doing is scoring rhetorical cheap shots against people we perceive to be our ideological and theological enemies. Now, under any set of circumstances, that would be aesthetically repugnant, and it would also be impossible to reconcile with the ecclesiology of communion, which is our official teaching. But in this brave new world I've tried to describe to you of dazzling new forces, creating an utterly new future for the church, both from within and from without, this way of doing business, of this kind of never-ending ecclesiastical war of all against all, this is a prescription for paralysis, and it is a prescription for self-destruction. And therefore, what we are going to require is a new commitment to a spirituality of communion in the 21st century. And make no mistake, creating and sustaining that spirituality is not, in the first instance, a work for our hierarchy. It has to be done in communion with them, of course. But the diffusion of a spirituality has to be a bottom-up project before it can be imposed from the top down, which means it is a work for all of us. And as the guy who is your chronicler and your scribe, that is the one who gets paid to watch what you do and then run off and write about it and talk about it on TV, I look forward to watching you rise to this occasion, to watching the Jesuits once again assume in Jesuit institutions and those inspired by the charisms of the Jesuits, to assume that leadership role, standing at the frontiers of culture, including those cultures within the church itself, and to help us in this incredibly urgent project of fostering, sustaining, rebuilding, and animating a culture and a spirituality of communion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and God bless you.